Hi, and thank you for joining me for another short talk. And friends, today I wanted to discuss Rosh HaShanah and Yom Teruah. Friends, the reason I think this is important is because there are many, mainly online, who really make a mountain out of a molehill, thinking that this is in some way proof that the rabbinic is completely disconnected from actual Torah. And really, in a defense of Torah Shabbat Peh and those who embrace Divrei Sofrim, friends, I'm here to tell you that this is no issue at all, nor has it ever been. The problem is that many who attack Rosh Hashanah typically lack an overall picture on how Judaism and Israel functioned before Jesus. And the reason I mention Jesus is because those who even bring this up as an issue are people who have come to Judaism either through Christianity or are still Christians, or as former Christians have adopted some Karaite form, ignorant form of Judaism, which typically gets them to view Jewish practices of today with their nearsighted lenses instead of trying to learn from those who came before, specifically from those we call Chazal. So, why do Orthodox Jews refer to Yom Teruah as Rosh Hashanah? Well, first, you must know that Orthodox Jewry has never replaced Yom Teruah with Rosh Hashanah. The problem is that with those who make this claim is that they take what the average uneducated Jew on the street says about the issue for what they think Judaism teaches on the issue, but have never really confronted a rabbinic authority to see what they have to say. In other words, rabbinic Judaism never replaced Yom Teruah for Rosh Hashanah. And neither does it overlook the fact that the Chumash calls the Nisan the first month. Now, one claim made by many who attack Rosh Hashanah is that Jews copied the month of Tishrei as well as Rosh Hashanah from the pagan world. While it is true that the month of Tishrei was adopted from the Babylonian calendar, and that every agrarian society of the time also considered that time of the year as the beginning of the year, one historical fact that many overlook is that Nisan, right? Nisan is not an exclusively Hebraic month either. In other words, it was a month in that part of the world and was used by pagan societies as well throughout, even before the Exodus story. Now, one has to understand that because the Almighty was dealing with frail man, introducing new concepts and festivals would only have acted as a huge stumbling block in getting the world ultimately civilized. So he did as he does many times in scripture, right? He takes pagan practices, i.e. a generally understood practice or idea of the time, and elevate it to a purposeful and ultimately ethical level, which gets those who try to disprove Torah to say, look, even Egyptians had such and such practice, which if you understand Torah and the purpose of Torah in context is really no issue at all. And this, friends, is no chiddush of mine, and the Rambam and many other rabbis teach the same idea. And friends, Rosh Hashanah is really no exception. In other words, every agrarian society always alluded to the beginning of the harvest season as the beginning of the agricultural year, what we call Nisan or Aviv, literally spring, and the seventh month, what we call Tishrei, i.e. Rosh Hashanah, as the head of the civil year, which included storing remaining crops, preparing the ground, and laying the first seeds. So the agricultural calendar ruled the yearly life of all men, which means that if we take a glimpse at other calendars of other civilizations of the time, we will see striking similarities to the Hebrew calendar. Okay? Clear so far? So, like we said, that the agricultural year began in Nisan. As a matter of fact, in Babylon, it had the same name as it does in the Jewish calendar, Nisan, but there was called it Nisanu. And in Assyrian, it was also called Nisan. And virtually, it's the same name in almost all societies that went by the lunar calendar. And Tishrei was considered the seventh month, which was considered to be the beginning of the year. For example, even in Turkey today, we still have the month of Nisan. But because they go by a solar calendar, it corresponds with April, their fourth month. Now again, Nisan is understood as deriving from a term related to spring or crop budding. Even in the Chumash, right? Nisan is also called Aviv, literally spring in Hebrew, because that's when crops showed evidence of growth. In other words, evidence of blessing. So every society, including the Jewish one, lived in a 2-year cycle calendar. Now, how was the calendar split into 2 cycles? Well, the first half of the cycle was for laboring, which always meant laboring in the fields. And the second half was for reaping the rewards of that labor. Now, the reason all this is foreign to most of you is because you are the victims of an over-mystification of religion. In other words, we have taken virtually every biblical principle and not only disconnected it from their agrarian roots, but also have used them to justify later mystical ideas, like about some sort of heavenly salvation or to bring some Messiah. But regardless, I have to remind you that this was not just how the Jewish calendar functioned, but how all agrarian societies of the time also functioned. Now, you're probably wondering, how can we have two beginnings in a year? So this is where it may get a little tricky for some of you. Friends, the first part of the calendar that appears in Scripture is actually the second half of the calendar. Again, starting with Nisan, which is actually the first month of the agrarian calendar. Now, mind you, I also have no problem calling it the first month of the year either, but being that everything in the calendrical cycle in Torah revolves around the idea of a seven, of the number seven, right? Whether it's a 7th day, 7th month, or even 7th year, right? Like the Shemitah, a 7th segment of labor, and then reward, then someone living in virtually every agrarian society would also have to conclude that the actual beginning of the year was the first month of labor, i.e. Tishrei, or towards the end of Tishrei, just like the first day of the week, right, comes right after the Sabbath. Clear enough? Now, because really, Rosh Hashanah is not really the first day of the 7th month, but it's the whole first half of the month in general, which encompassed Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. The first of the month all the way to the 21st, i.e. ending with Shemini Atzeret. And then only afterwards can one say that the calendrical week actually begun. In other words, the first 6 months was there for work and sowing, and the 7th month is a month of introspection. Just like Shabbat is a day of introspection, and at the end of that month, it ushers in 6 more months of labor. Similar to our 6 days of labor in our weekly Shabbat cycle. In other words, the first 6 months was for work and for sowing, and the 7th month is the month of introspection. Again, because this ties in with Shabbat, Rosh Hashanah, and the Shemitah year, all landing on the 7th. Shabbat, the 7th day, Rosh Hashanah, the 7th month, and the Shemitah year, the 7th year, all reminding us of the ethic that if one doesn't work, one doesn't eat in every aspect of life. Now, I really don't have a problem with certain groups disagreeing with others. However, what really bothers me, and the reason I decided to make this video, is that whenever groups disagree with Orthodox Jews or anything in the rabbinic world, there's always a divisive, evil, or even demonic intention applied to those they're disagreeing with. In other words, not only are we wrong, we're evil and intentionally perverting the Torah at the same time. Now, mind you, Orthodox Jews still call it the 7th month. In other words, if we paid no regard to Nisan being mentioned in the Torah as the first month, why didn't we just call Rosh Hashanah the first month? In other words, this, if anything, shows that those who attack us as perverters of Scripture perhaps never really tried to find out what Rabbinic Judaism actually teaches on the topic. Now, mind you, even Ezekiel, Yehezkel, calls it Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because even in Bavel, even in Babylon, the day meant the same, a Yom Teruah, a literal day of shouting where people in unison pleaded with their deity to bless the coming agricultural segment of the year. Again, what later became known as the Day of Judgment, which is why in Torah it also calls the first day of the 7th month Zichron Teruah, a sort of memorial shouting, telling the Almighty that we did what we're supposed to do, now please bless us, or in some way write us in a book. Nowadays, symbolically, we blow a shofar, but friends, please don't like many, lose the origins for what we do. Now again, friends, I have to remind you that in the calendrical system, the 7th month was considered the first month because this is when things began again. In other words, what was known in every society at that time as the beginning of the civil year, which included living off the portions of the previous calendrical cycle. In other words, it was time to store and prepare for another agricultural year beginning in Nisan, Aviv, in the spring. In other words, while they were witnessing all the previous year's crops wither away, the 7th month was when the Almighty, based on our deeds, decided if we would merit a good crop for the following year. Again, this was Rosh HaShanah, which was also tied in with the Day of Judgment in Judaism, because it was the day that the Almighty determined whether Israel would be blessed with plentiful rain and a good crop for the following year, as well as its physical security. Yom Kippur was the day that the judgment was sealed. That's what Kippur means. It means to cover up, to seal up, actually referring to being sealed in a book. Now, later on, while Israel was in exile, it began to spiritualize everything of the biblical holidays, so that Rosh Hashanah became a day of spiritual judgment, and the Day of Atonement became a sealing of your spiritual validation, what Christianity later confused with a concept of salvation. Again, ideas that don't appear in Torah. Now, it's not wrong to personalize and apply Torah understandings in other areas of our lives. And I do believe that these dates were created to build our ethical conscience in such a manner. But when it's used to justify practices that eventually draw you away from Torah completely, like it has done with many in the Christian world, that's when Jews must speak out. And for those who like tying everything into Agadah, a great midrashic or Agadic understanding to the whole ordeal of linking the creation of man with Rosh Hashanah was really to teach this same principle. Just like Chazal teach that man was created on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Teruah, on a Shabbat as a sign of a new beginning, right? Chazal teach that they spent exactly 1 week in the garden because by failing to keep God's instructions, the Almighty did not renew their lease for the following Shabbat and threw them out, which ties in perfectly with Israel's exile and redemption. That when we get our act together, we will one day, God willing, be allowed to reconstruct and enjoy the land and the Torah calendar cycle as times of blessing, unlike the sorrow we constantly feel in exile today. Friends, for more information about everything Jewish, please visit bejewish.org. Thank you.